We're going to have some other girls joining us, I'm sure.
Okay.
So hi, everyone. My name is Sheri West. Thank you so much for joining our virtual book club today. We hope you're all home safe and well and staying positive in quarantine. But today we're going to give you a little dose of sisterhood and give you an opportunity to meet an amazing author, which will certainly be uplifting for you. So we're going to introduce to you Rebecca Behrens. She's the author of 4 critically acclaimed middle grade novels that explore famous historical figures and fascinating places. So not only is she a brilliant author, but she teaches a lot about history as well. Those books' names are When Audrey Met Alice, The Summer of Lost and Found, The Last Grand Adventure, and her most recent, the award-winning Disaster Days, which just recently was named to the Bank Street Best Children's Book of the Year. Congratulations on that, Rebecca.
Thanks. Yeah.
And for those of you who don't know, I want to introduce my 16-year-old daughter, Olivia. She's a voracious reader, so we thought she would be the perfect person to facilitate today's book club. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Rebecca and Olivia.
Thanks so much.
So welcome, Rebecca. As my mom said, I am a voracious reader, and this is an amazing experience. So as you all know, today we're going to focus on your most recent book, The Disaster Days, and which has been described as Hatchet meets the Babysitters Club in this epic and thrilling survival story about pushing oneself to the limit in the face of crisis. So how this is going to work is I'm going to ask I have a couple questions,
okay,
and then we're going to turn it to the other girls, so the attendees, and to the girls, so Ellery and Juliana, and any more who join. You can type your questions in the chat, and then if you want to also ask them to Rebecca, we can unmute you, and then you can ask your question. But I'll start, and I just wanted to start by asking, what was your inspiration for writing this book?
That's a great question. So my inspiration was actually something that I read. I think it was July of 2015. I was at my day job at the time. I was an editor for textbooks, for reading textbooks. And I worked at that job for many years while I was publishing books and being an author too. And it was during my lunch break. I needed something to read while I quickly ate a salad at my desk. And there was this article that was trending on Twitter from the New Yorker magazine called The Really Big One. So I clicked to read it because I was like, well, everyone is talking about this. I want to know what they're talking about. And this article was all about the risk of a major earthquake in the Seattle area on the Cascadia subduction zone. If you've read the book, I get into that, so you probably know what I'm talking about. At the time, I didn't know that this fault line actually existed. I didn't know that Seattle and Portland and the Pacific Northwest were at risk for earthquakes. And the article, even though it's nonfiction, it really did a great job of storytelling, and it was very tense. And I'm reading all these details about, how someday this earthquake is going to happen in the region, and it's going to have a lot of huge effects on the infrastructure that, people are going to have, problems with their houses, at their schools. And a detail that really struck me was when the author said, her name is Catherine Schultz, I want to give her credit, that when something like this happens, people who live in more rural areas, if there's maybe only one bridge that connects their town to, the rest of the Seattle area, or if they're, living in a community where you have to take a ferry to get to and from an island, it might take people days or even weeks to get back to their homes because of the damage that could be done to roads and stuff like that. So when I read that, I immediately thought well, what would happen if someone was babysitting when this disaster happens? And as a kid, I was a babysitter as a teen, and I also really loved reading stuff like the Babysitters Club books. So as an author, I read that detail, and I immediately thought of this concept for a plot where a young babysitter is with her 2 younger charges. This earthquake happens. Suddenly she's in charge because the parents can't get back for a while. So the story was really born out of that. So it was something that I just sat down to read, and I'm not expecting to have this idea for a book that I would then spend years writing and researching and publishing. So that's always one of my pieces of advice for young writers is to read a lot, because you never know where your inspiration is going to come from.
That's awesome. Thank you. And so obviously this book is very relevant, especially right now with the COVID-19 global pandemic. So do you see any parallels, and if so, what, between this book and the pandemic?
I do. When I was writing this book, it still felt kind of like, fiction, like dystopian fiction to me, to write about an environment where people might be stuck in their homes, where people might not have access to the normal, foods that they would eat, where things like internet connectivity would not be happening. That seemed like a little far-fetched to me. So I think, like a lot of people, it's been really shocking with this pandemic, the lockdowns that we're living in now. Like, it's a really unexpected environment. I think fortunately for us right now, we're not having the interruptions to things like cell service and electricity, and like we can still be on Zoom and FaceTiming with our loved ones, and that is great, and doing distance learning. That's something the characters in my book, obviously they were in an environment where they couldn't turn the lights on, they couldn't turn on the heat in their houses. But I think the interruptions to our daily routines, and maybe having certain types of food or products be really hard to get right now. Like, you can't just go and buy hand sanitizer or a roll of toilet paper. There are some kind of like strange connections between the two. And I think also the kind of the emotional side of it, feeling like you have, this life that you love and you appreciate, and there are all these things you like to do and you're excited about. And it seems like in an instant, everything changes and you're in a world that feels really new and unfamiliar and anxiety inducing. So I definitely relate to that side of the characters in my book a lot more now. And I think a lot of readers maybe will, read it and realize that they can empathize a little more with the characters and how unsettled they are in their new environment.
And so Ellery had a question. She said, "We have had many big earthquakes. What type of earthquake was the book designed after?"
Great question. So it is designed after a major earthquake. I think that's like a technical term, like on the scales, the moment magnitude scales that scientists use. Major in this case would be above a 9.0. Those are really, really uncommon. So the really famous San Andreas fault line in California that we think about a lot, and there are a lot of media, a lot of movies are focused on that. Scientists don't think it would actually be possible for the San Andreas to have something as large as a 9.0. A big earthquake in Southern California might be something like, 7 to 8 on the scales. So a 9.0 is a rare and really strong earthquake. The last earthquake that actually struck on the Cascadia subduction zone, which is the fault line in the Pacific Northwest, was above a 9. That happened on January 26, 1700, I believe. So, over 300 years ago. Scientists, they didn't know for a long time that an earthquake had actually struck this region before, because it was before we had recorded history in the English language in that area. Although, like, the local people, the native people who lived there, they had their own, way of recording history and storytelling. But for, English settlers who eventually came across the country, they had no way of knowing that this had happened in the past. And it took until like the 1970s when scientists realized that, there were certain pieces of evidence, like these petrified trees that were in a forest along the coast, which had, the trees had become petrified, so like turned to stone when the tsunami happened 300 years ago. So they used a lot of like various, geology and other scientific techniques to figure out that there actually had been an earthquake there that was above a 9.0 300 years ago.
So interesting. And Ellery, I think, had a follow-up question, kind of. In the story, did you like have a specific year that this was set, that the earthquake happened?
Great question again. I think I was kind of thinking like around today. So in that sense, it's almost like an alternate history. Like if this earthquake had happened in 2019. And I say that in part because, I think now, after having gone through or going through the pandemic, people are maybe a little more aware of some of like emergency preparedness stuff. I think when things happen in the future, whether it's like a tornado or a hurricane or something, I kind of suspect people will have more supplies in their homes and be a little less, shocked by what has happened. I think the setting for this is a time like today where people really were not prepared for the earthquake. And I also want to say that after that article came out that I mentioned in 2015, the really big one, because that article was so popular and got so much attention, I think more people in the Pacific Northwest are aware of this risk and doing the protective things now that mean when an earthquake eventually happens, people are going to be okay because we've prepared for them.
And I had another question. So what are Hannah's key characteristics that enable her to navigate and kind of overcome this crisis that you should think that girls today should have?
Oh, I love this question. What are her key characteristics? I think one of them is that she's thoughtful. I think that, when things are going on, Hannah kind of she takes in the information around her. She doesn't jump to an action. She kind of thinks through her options. Even if she's kind of scared and unsure, she gives it a minute to sort of consider what is her best choice of action. I think she also has a lot of personal responsibility. Even though she feels that she's inexperienced as a babysitter and she has self-doubt about whether she can do this, she feels responsible to herself and to the Matlock kids and to their parents and their community to try and do her best job. I think she's also, she's really good at being resourceful. So taking the information and the tools that she has and being resourceful and creative and figuring out, well, how can I make this work? So things in the book how she figures out how to boil water when they run out, pitching a tent when she realizes the house may not be safe inside. She does a really great job of kind of rolling with the action and, taking things in stride. And I also think that, something that was important to me in writing her as a character is, she is kind of an every kid. She's not someone who goes into the situation already knowing a lot about dealing with emergencies. She kind of has to learn on the go. And she does express those self-doubts, but she's sort of forgiving of herself in the moment. And she knows that as long as she's doing the best that she can, if she's trying her best, that's really what you have to ask of yourself. And I think that's important too.
Yeah, definitely. And so, on a different note, I was looking through your Instagram and saw that you wrote a Rebel Girls podcast about Hedy Lamarr.
I did.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love her. Can you talk about that and other future projects you might be working on?
Sure. So I partnered with Rebel Girls. I wrote the script for their podcast about Hedy Lamarr, which was read by Tatiana Maslany, which was super cool. So that was a lot of fun getting to research her life. I read books about her. I watched this amazing documentary called Bombshell, which is available streaming on Netflix, I believe, or at least it was a couple months ago. It's hopefully still up there. So that was really cool that I'd never written a podcast script before. That was kind of like a new medium for me. I've done some nonfiction writing before. Back when I used to be a textbook editor, I did that a lot. So, I was kind of familiar with that. But it was really cool to take someone's, life and to kind of write a nonfiction piece about them that still had storytelling elements. So, you kind of there was a bit of a narrative, even though it's nonfiction. I am working on another script for Rebel Girls. I'm not sure if I can say at this point who it's about. So, check back. It'll be on my Instagram or my website whenever that one is recorded and goes up.
That's so cool. Ellery was wondering, what advice do you have for future writers? She says that she writes on a writing app for reading and writing, and she wants any advice that you have for making good stories.
Ooh, great question. So my first advice is to write every day if you can. It doesn't have to be, if you're working on a short story, a novel, a play, whatever, you don't necessarily have to write on that project every day. It's okay to take days off. And if you're feeling a little stuck, you can always do something like, write an email to a friend about your project, telling them about what you're excited about, in what you're writing. Sometimes that kind of can spark some creativity. So writing a little bit every day. I also think that Sometimes it helps to write by hand. I write my stuff on my laptop most of the time, especially because of deadlines. You know, you don't want to write it in a notebook and have to copy it all out or type it all out again. But there have been studies done that it kind of uses a different sort of creativity when you write by hand. Sometimes it can open yourself up to new ideas. So, you know, especially if you're feeling a little blocked in a project, or if you don't know what you want to write next, I recommend writing in a notebook. Sometimes a notebook can be kind of like a safe space where you can play, where it doesn't feel like, you know, you're typing something and you want to fill the page and like, you know, you have an end goal or something. You can just kind of play in a notebook. And any other advice for writing? I think that, you know, setting goals really helps me. I try not to be too strict about them because, you know, creative process, like some days you feel super creative, some days you don't. But I do set a goal of, you know, maybe it's I'm going to write 2 pages every day, or, you know, 1,000 words when I'm in the middle of drafting a new story. And my last bit of advice is to remember that refilling the well is part of the writing process. So that means like you have to take in information and inspiration from the world around you in order to tell great stories. So it can be easy sometimes to feel like, oh, I really want to work on my writing, so I need to sit in front of my computer and work on it all day long. And that's true, but you also need to go outside and jog with a friend, or look at the spring flowers, or go shopping, or go to a restaurant and experience things that kind of are going to, you know, build ideas in you and inspire you. So make sure you take time to do stuff that you enjoy that's not just sitting in front of the computer typing.
That's awesome advice. Another question we have is, who or what inspired your characters in this story?
Who or what inspired my characters? I had a little bit of inspiration from the kids that I babysat when I was a teenager. Zoe and Oscar are not, they're fictional. They're totally fictional creations, but sometimes there are elements to their characters that are my next door neighbors when I was growing up, who I took care of a lot when I was a teenager, and I loved them dearly. So there may have been a few personality details that I borrowed from them. Actually, the last name Matlock is from one of my very best friends. She lives in Seattle. Her name is Jessica Matlock. She has 2 kids, Daisy and Jack. And when I was working on the book, I would text Jessica whenever I had a Seattle question. And so, you know, sometimes it would be stuff like, what kind of heating system does your house have? And how could it get turned off? You know, or like what kind, you know, what's your plumbing situation? Just sort of figure out the logistics in the home of like, would they still be able to use the sink and the toilet after an earthquake? And what would it take for the house to lose heat and electricity? So she answered all of my Seattle questions and stuff too. Like I would text her and say, you know, what kind of food do you like? You know, what would be a special tourist food that someone would eat in Seattle? I'm not sure if I ended up working that into the book, but she was sort of my resource as like a person, a Seattleite who would know. So because of that, I gave the Matlock characters her last name as a thank you.
That's awesome. And I have a question more about like writing, kind of like your process.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you develop the characters like that are going to be in your story?
That's a great question. So Hannah, I had sort of going in, before I wrote this book, I wrote a really detailed proposal for it. So I did a synopsis, which is like a detailed outline that was probably 25 or 26 pages long. So it was like super detailed. So I had the plot really outlined, and I knew the character of Hannah pretty well. You know, I knew that this was going to be her second time babysitting. I knew that she was going to have some health concerns. I knew that she was gonna be struggling with feeling like she's not a capable person, and that would be important to her character. So I really had an idea of who she was before I went in. With Zoe and Oscar, they surprised me a little more. I didn't realize at first that Zoe was gonna sort of sometimes butt heads with Hannah a little bit, and that Zoe was going to be pretty capable for a 10 or 11-year-old. You know, things like being able to assemble a tent on her own. So that kind of developed as I was writing. I hadn't sort of planned for her to be sometimes a little bit of a source of conflict for Hannah. So when I start a project, I tend to know my main character and their motivation pretty well. And the supporting characters, I know enough about them to, start writing descriptions and start putting them in scenes, but their characters really develop over the course of that first draft. And by the time I have a rough draft, a completed rough draft, I've usually figured out, oh, I really like this aspect of this character that came up in a couple of scenes. And when I go back and I revise the book, because I will revise something like countless times before it's published, I'll know what aspects of their personality I kind of want to play up in other scenes and make them a little more prominent. So it's a process. Like I start with the basics with the character, and then based on how the first draft turns out, I might go in and enhance something or pull back on other details.
And then Ellery was wondering what inspired you to be a writer?
Inspired me to be a writer. I was a huge, voracious reader as a kid. My mom was an English teacher. She actually taught school at my middle school. So when I was in 7th grade, she taught 7th grade English. When I was in 8th grade, they switched and she taught 8th grade English. She wasn't my teacher, but my friends had her, which was a little awkward. But because of that, books were a really big thing in our household. I always loved reading, and she's a huge reader herself. So I loved literature, and I knew that I wanted to have a job that would involve it in some way. And after college, I started working as an editor. For a while, I was an editor for textbooks. And then I also worked as a copy editor for some trade publishers, so Penguin Random House and Disney, and working on other authors' fiction. And I loved that job, but after doing it for a while, I started to feel like, well, I really want to try telling my own stories. That I was tired of just, working on other authors' pieces and helping them enhance their work. So at that point, I decided to try and write something with the goal of being published. So, I've been a lifelong lover of books and a lifelong reader. It wasn't really until a little bit later that I got interested in writing.
So I'm just coming back on to say thank you so much, Rebecca, for both being an inspired writer and sharing your gifts with our girls and our community. We can't wait to see what's next and to follow you. And I think the Rebel Girls connection is so interesting too, because we love Rebel Girls.
It's an awesome organization.
I want to tell everyone that they can follow you at Rebecca Behrens Books on social media, and you also have an awesome website with lots of different resources. And so for people that want to learn more and check out some of those resources, that's at RebeccaBehrens.com/resources/the-disaster-days. And one of the girls asked how they can keep in touch. So I think probably social media is the best way.
Yeah, that's great. I am on Instagram, Twitter, not super active there, but I do check my ads like pretty much every day. And on Facebook too, also at Rebecca Behrens Books on Facebook.
And we hope that you're in quarantine finding this a creative time. You're finding a peaceful time to do more writing, because we can't wait to read what you.
Yeah. Thank you. I should have another book releasing in October. I have a book called Alone in the Woods. It's another kind of survival adventure book. It's currently scheduled to publish in October 2020. With the pandemic, there's some question about printing availability. It's possible it might be delayed. I will update that on my website if that's the case.
Awesome. So thank you so much to all the girls for joining, and thank you again, Rebecca. We really.
Thank you.
Right.